Hello. In today's conversation, I'm joined by process theologian Bruce Epperly, and we have a great conversation about his new book, um, and his book on Whitehead and Jesus, and all kinds of other great topics around faith and mysticism, and even to get a little bit into politics and our mutual frustrations with some of that. But I want to say a little bit before I let you hear this episode. I want to say a little bit about Alfred North Whitehead because we really didn't get into who he is and why we're talking about him. So I'll just give a little brief background on Whitehead here, and then we'll go into the episode. But Alfred North Whitehead was a mathematician and philosopher born in Great Britain, and then he was invited in his 60s to Harvard in the 1920s to teach at Harvard. And so he spent the rest of his life there at Harvard teaching and writing mostly about the area that's called metaphysics, which is really it's about understanding the structure and the nature of reality. And so that's what Whitehead was doing in his work. And we mentioned Charles Hartshorne, who was a student of Whitehead. And Hartshorne went on to take Whitehead's philosophy and talk about it in a more strictly theological way. And so Charles Hartshorne was writing what's become known as process theology. Whitehead's work, he called it a philosophy of organism as opposed to a philosophy of mechanism. And but it's also been referred to nowadays as process philosophy. And so the line is that Hartshorne was a student of Whitehead, and then John Cobb was a student of Hartshorne, and John Cobb ended his career teaching at Claremont School of Theology alongside David Ray Griffin and Marjorie Sue Hockey, who are other leading the kind of the grandparents today of process theology. I got my doctorate at Claremont School of Theology and had a semester of teaching with Bruce Epperly, who has now obviously become a colleague and friend of mine. So, thanks for being here, and let's dive in. Welcome to The Sacred Everywhere. I'm Dr. Sheri Kling, and in this space we explore how the sacred shows up in real life, in our questions, our struggles, our longing, and our hope. Can we find the sacred in every place and everyone? Let's see. All right, well, welcome, Bruce Epperly, to The Sacred Everywhere. So good to see you.
It's a joy.
Yeah. So you are a theologian and pastor and have been a professor, including my own professor for a period of time.
It was a
And
high point.
well, it's so wonderful to call you a colleague now
Yes.
and to have these kinds of conversations. So let's just first start by you. Now, you are one of the most prolific writers I know. So talking about a new book with you is like you have to be. You could do it every other month, it seems.
Yeah.
But one of the most recent books that you've released is about Whitehead and Jesus.
Yes.
So why don't we begin by you just telling us a little bit about what led you to write this particular book right
Well,
now?
it's an interesting, in many ways, it's a retrospect and a prospect. It's part of a series of five books, which some of them, Whitehead and Teilhard and
Yeah.
Thurman and Francis, and Jesus is the fourth, and Plato will be the fifth of the Whitehead
Ah.
analects. All of these books, in a way, emerged from what changed my life in the early 1970s. Uh,
Mm.
they aren't an old man's book because I don't look backwards. I'm looking forwards in the book, but in the early 1970s, it was either 72 or 73, I encountered Whitehead, Plato, Thurman, Teilhard,
Mm.
and I'd already encountered Jesus, but I encountered Jesus in a new way. And, and,
Mm.
and no one had ever written books devoted specifically to these topics before. and I thought, well, let me do this because I'm looking back at my own history as a theologian and a
Hmm.
pastor, and those five people shaped who I am today intellectually. And it all came at me within about 2 years' time. I
Hmm.
was a college student at the sophomore or junior in college, and I was a spiritual seeker. And I happened to chance upon a Whitehead course that was taught by Richard Keedy, another one
Hmm.
of John Cobb's students, and Dick Keedy. Um, my pastor once said, "Why don't you take this Whitehead course with me?" I didn't know anything. I knew a little bit about Whitehead because my Plato professor knew the Hartshorns, and
Oh,
so
really?
I want to give plaudits to Marie Fox. Uh,
Uh-huh.
Neither Richard nor Marie Fox wrote much, but I wouldn't be me without them. I
Wow.
wouldn't be me. And she had a process streak with her through the Platonic sense. But this has been, my life as a pastor and as a professor has been influenced by all these, but especially Whiteheadian or process Christianity. And when I was conceiving this series, I realized that no one had really written a book that was specifically about Whitehead and Jesus.
Mm.
And and Whitehead, of course, throughout his writings, says some pretty important things about Jesus.
He does, right.
And our histories, Whitehead's and mine, are somewhat similar, although he's Anglican and I was raised Baptist. We were both children of the manse. We both grew up in highly religious environments. I think probably Whitehead's was more rarefied than mine, but I
Mm.
suspect Whitehead's father had bishops at the house. I am
Yeah.
sure that they did the creed, the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene every week. I'm sure that on Christmas Eve they sang once in Royal David City.
Yeah.
And, and of course, Whitehead has this deep spirituality. I'd even call it mysticism. He, in one place, says that all philosophy is mystical. Uh,
Mm.
that's deep down. When he's a college student, and I felt a kinship with this. He was in a club called the Apostles, and they asked the question, "What do you want out of life?" And he said, "I want to see God. I want to see."
Whitehead did.
Yes,
Wow.
and
Wow.
he, I think, strayed away from traditional religion just as I had. And I'm not sure I'm definitely an institutional church, but I'm not sure have ever been in traditional religion. But
Hmm.
I believe that in the background of his thought is the picture of Jesus, not necessarily Christianity, but he
Hmm.
makes some conversations about Jesus, that uh, Buddhism has the philosophy and it's looking for the embodiment. Christianity has Jesus and it's looking for the philosophy. Or,
Uh-huh.
that wonderful phrase and process and reality in the midst of all this pretty dense stuff. He said, the Galilean vision and,
Hmm.
and how it contrasts with Caesar, which is still very much alive today. Uh,
Yeah.
the politicians I like and the politicians I don't like all flirt with Caesar.
Yeah. Right.
They
Exactly.
all flirt with
Exactly.
Caesar and putting power ahead of the well-being. And I
Yeah.
think beneath the surface, Jesus plays a much more important role than's often been given credit. Now, I admit people may push
In
back
terms of in terms of in Whitehead's writing?
write his writing. I think
Yeah.
Jesus is a silent partner, a
Huh.
silent companion that even I think influences his notion of interdependence and
Hmm.
persuasion. I have in Ventures of Ideas, Whitehead says that Jesus embodied what Plato was talking about in terms of persuasion. Jesus is the incarnation of Platonic persuasion. Uh, and I think that's a marvelous comment. And I'm not trying to convert Whitehead, but I'm trying to look at him through a different lens, and the lens that I've lived with. I mean,
Hmm.
in all these five books, they're somewhat autobiography, much like Confessions of Augustine. This is what this is what empowered me. This is what inspired me. And I will say one last thing. And uh, the I have felt that process theology, and this is your work too. You're one of the leaders in this, Sheri. You're
Mm.
one of the leaders. Process theology has suffered from being far too abstract,
Yeah.
not related to the concrete experiences of persons psychologically and spiritually and relationally,
Hmm.
politically. It stayed in the stratosphere, and Whitehead himself doesn't like that. He talks about that
Yeah.
airplane flight. Uh,
Yeah.
and I have an evangelical approach to process thought that I really think process and open relational thought is important, and it deserves to be in the front row in a world in which many Christians seem to be worshiping Caesar and glad of it, and seem to justify the killing of people in Minneapolis or invasion of other countries and destabilization of governments. That's the Jesus thing to do. I think process theology has a gospel, and I have a feeling, just like Tom Ward, that we need to preach the gospel to the ex-evangelicals
Hmm.
for whom Jesus is still important, but they can't find it in church. And
Yeah.
process gives you the living Jesus.
Right, right. And just to circle back for a second to and probably I'm thinking I'll record an intro to this conversation, and I'll probably in that intro give a little bit of background on Whitehead and who he was. I don't necessarily want to take the time to do that while I have you here now. But I will say that the comment about the airplane, that Whitehead was talking about, that all philosophy should start with experience on the ground and then rise up above and begin to talk about at
Yes,
the abstract level how to think about the experience,
yes,
but always starts on the ground and then has to come back down to the ground like the airplane
yes,
has to land. And that's one thing that I loved, seeing in both Whitehead and Carl Jung, my other
yes,
favorite
yes,
favorite dead European white guy.
yeah,
And so they are both so focused on experience and real life. There's a part I was just rereading a part where referring to Jung's ideas about different kinds of psi experience, or
yes, yes,
psycho paranormal experience, or religious experience, or whatever it was, and he
yes,
said these are psychological realities. And it's my job to find out, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said it's my job to find out why these are psychological realities, even if what I find is not in agreement with my preconceived notions.
yes, yes. And that's really important. And it's important to test these out, either
Mm-hmm.
ethically or spiritually or theologically or relationally. As an old Baptist, and and a preacher, I oftentimes ask the question. It comes out of the black church, preach it. And
Yeah.
uh, and I believe this stuff. You can preach this stuff. As a matter of fact, I read your sermons regularly, Sheri,
Mm,
when you post them, and you're preaching it, and you're trying to make this stuff come alive to your congregation. And
yeah.
I'm trying
Without
also.
without without labeling it, because
Yes, yes,
there's no need for anyone in the pew to say, "Oh, she's telling us about process theology," or even to acknowledge the terms and the jargon of
yes.
the theologians. Like you said, it's where the rubber hits the road. It's, does this help your life?
Yes. And I think that the challenge is to, and it's been part of my work, it's something you've been doing, Jay McDaniel's doing it, Trip Fuller's doing it, Tom Ward's doing it, to use the best you can the language you normally speak in.
Mm-hmm.
There's a joke about a friend of mine tells about her pastor, and he's now retired, but every year he was a process guy, and every year he felt obligated to preach a sermon on process theology. And the people came out after the service saying, "Our pastor's really smart, but we didn't understand a word of it."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I want somebody to feel what it's like to have the option of God saying, "Go do it," or have the feel what it's like when God wants you to be more free. When
Hmm.
God wants you to adventure beyond where you've been, where you can look and you've been doing this in Sacred Everywhere, where you see the world in the eyes of wonder. I mean, the
Mm.
one
Yeah.
thing that Whitehead and Jesus had in common, and in Victor Lowe's book, and I had the opportunity for 1 year to be his teaching assistant or research assistant when he was doing the biography of Whitehead.
Wow.
Whitehead said that he wasn't much good unless he had a few hours to himself. And as a boy, it reminds me of myself, he used to range around the English countryside for a couple hours a day. And when I was a boy, and this was a different time, and people weren't afraid of everything, and it
Yeah.
was just as bad, but we didn't know how bad it was. I would
Right.
wander around our Salinas Valley town for hours at a time, just
Hmm.
just looking at things and
Yeah.
just noticing the wonder of things, and taking my bike out to the Salinas River and riding up and down the little hillocks there, and then just looking at things. And there is
Hmm.
that sense of the sacredness of moments of experience, the sacredness of an occasion of experience. And of course,
Yeah.
Jesus, consider the lilies. I mean, that wasn't just an object lesson. I can imagine Jesus being a little bit like Mary Oliver in the summer day, just
Hmm.
looking at a lily for a while,
Yeah.
looking at a lily and watching a bird go by. I mean, one of the books that I forgot to mention, maybe I mentioned, was a Francis book, Whitehead and Francis, and the same sense that the swallows, the little bugs on the ground are not mere matter. When Mary Oliver's looking at that grasshopper chewing a blade of grass, you think about the millions of processes that go into that grasshopper that most of us would just step on and not think twice about it. That
Right.
it is truly a wonder, and as Heshe would say, radical amazement. And you see that in Whitehead. Just the
Yeah.
sort of, if you get beyond the jargon, this is somebody who's seeing the divinity in an occasion of experience, or as Blake would say, and seeing the universe in a grain of sand. Uh,
Hmm.
it's a mystical metaphysic.
Yeah, yeah, it is. You're talking about your childhood and wandering around Salinas Valley reminds me of, I grew up in a little bedroom suburb of New York, but in New Jersey, called a little town called Roselle. And, we maybe
Oh yeah,
30,000 people in a three
yeah,
mile radius and
yeah,
little homes, mostly blue collar. Um, and I used to, so we didn't have a lot of expanses of nature around us. It was just a lot of homes and
yeah,
roads and busy, kind of busy thoroughfares.
yeah.
But we were near a golf course, and
Yes.
at the after I would eat dinner when I was, probably 11, 12, 13 years old, we had a dog named Cuddles, and
Oh yeah.
I would take Cuddles on a walk over to where there was a creek, and on the other side of the creek was the fence to the golf course, but there was a hole in it there.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
would take the dog, walk over there. We'd cross the creek, climb up, and go through the fence. And I loved taking my shoes off and walking on the carpeted grass of the golf
yes,
course. Now, of course, nowadays I know all the chemicals that are going into that, but I would be there with the dog and have her on the leash and have my shoes
yes.
off and be walking around. And then of course I'd have to keep my eye open for any of the crew, the maintenance crew or
Yeah, oh yeah.
whoever.
They don't want you on the course.
No, and so there were times I'd have to kind of duck into a
Yeah,
grove of trees to
yeah,
hide, And I remember this one time in particular, like sort of diving into this little circle of pine trees, and it was like a little secret garden. It was like a little
Yes.
enclave of silence,
Yeah.
and it was a holy space. And I just remember looking up and seeing this little barn owl, what I
Yes.
think I remember as a barn owl, and just being so moved by the presence of this beautiful creature in
Well,
this sacred space with me, and my dog.
well,
And
yeah.
so many incidences like that. I mean, even now, I walk around greeting everything: squirrels, ducks, lizards, the birds,
Yes.
and even started when I was in Scotland. I remember walking around Iona and
Oh, yes.
and oddly seeing some snails and some that had shells that looked like Scotch plaid. Like
Yeah.
they were
Yeah.
very Scottish in their looks. But I remember picking up a snail because I had heard people talk about how curious they can be, and so I had it, of course it goes into its shell, but then as I
Yes.
held it and talked to it, it started to stick its little head out and wave its little
Yeah.
antenna,
Yeah.
and they then sort of are tasting you, and
Yes.
feeling you out, and we
Yeah.
had this little interaction, and then I put him back down on the ground and went on my way. Now other people would be like, yeah, I'd be picking those up and eating them, but
Yeah. Yeah, and you're exactly right. I mean, the world is strewn with wonder. As you were talking, I was thinking it isn't all just rural wonder.
right.
Annie Dillard. I think this might be in A Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Talks about how being as a little child, she would, and this is au courant in terms of the fate of the penny, but she would put pennies in little cracks on the sidewalk or in the sort of, I guess it's called a crotch of a tree. I'm told that has
Uh-huh.
double entendre. I realize, but little parts of the tree, little pennies, with the hope that somebody would see them
Huh.
and see a gift of life to them, a gift of the universe. And then she
Yeah.
remembered this as an adult woman, and maybe she became the poet and writer that she was because as a child she saw and looked for. She was trailing clouds of glory, as Wordsworth would say, and
Mm.
of course,
Mm.
Wordsworth and Romantics meant a lot to Whitehead, and
Mm-hmm.
so. I mean, I think that what Christianity needs process theology. And I think those of us who are Christians uh, can see the impact of Jesus on Whitehead's thought and maybe liberating it a little bit. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't apologize for this because, of course, when I think about Jesus, I'm not restricting Jesus to the doctrines of Christianity, or I'm not restricting
Mm-hmm.
Jesus to the church I attend, or to Christianity at all. I think all the great teachers were not bound by their religious followers. Buddha
Yeah.
probably wasn't a Buddhist. Uh, I don't
Well, and
know.
and let me interrupt for a second because I
Yes,
had written, one of the things I put in my notes was a place where in this book you write, Jesus belongs to the world, not just Christianity, and the Jesus I affirm is at home in an ashram, zendo, temple, mosque, woodlands, laboratory, library, and any place people seek truth, healing, and community. Christ is, as John Cobb asserts, the way that excludes no authentic ways.
yes, yes. And and
I
I and
love
I
that.
and part of my again, I have to give homage to John Cobb. In many ways, Cobb's Christologies, my work is perhaps a way of making them concrete. Uh,
Hmm.
John's work is as good as any you'll ever find and is perceptive. I think he, if not the greatest theologian of his time, was certainly in the top five.
Yeah.
And I believe that what I am trying to do is make Cobb come alive too. We honor our teachers. We honor
Hmm.
our teachers not by repeating what they said, but by taking what they're doing in other directions, taking what they're doing, and of course Cobb himself, in some of his later work, uh, freed himself a little from the desire to just be a sort of the process tradition. But when he began to write more about his experiences and
Yeah.
how his experiences informed his theology, and Dave Griffin, who another one of my teachers, I have to give David homage too. Those were my two, along with Bernie Loomer, my three doctor professors, and
Hmm.
those days. And David, toward the last handful of years of his life, uh, began to move from the words to the experiences, began to write about mysticism, and he began to write about
Mm.
psychic experiences. In his last book
Yeah.
about William James and Whitehead and immortality, uh,
Right.
David was the ultimate rationalist, of
Yes.
anyone that I knew and processed thought. It was most logical person I knew, and I honor and learned a great deal from David. I mean, he's just, but I think he also opened up to the broader non-rational, the broader
Yes.
trans-rational, whatever term you want to use. That's the
Hmm.
size too deep for words, or somewhere. Uh, Whitehead says that mothers know things in their hearts that philosophers don't.
Right.
And that heart, that sense, it's in your cell as well as your soul. Uh,
Yeah.
that for me is where people's lives will change.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and thinking speaking of David Griffin, I just also remember and the sometimes over rationality of many process theologians and process thinkers. It's all very intellectualized, which
Yeah.
is which is all well and good, but again, I always say if theology doesn't do real work in the world and help change
Yes.
people's lives, it's not of any value. And there's a place in the book Archetypal Process,
Yes.
which
Yes.
is bringing together James Hillman and other Jungians with process thinkers. This happened back in the 80s, and the book came out, I think, in 1990.
Yeah.
Where Griffin says something like, here we are as process philosophers and theologians thinking that, because we're not so popular in terms of the uptake of the great swaths of readership,
Yes. Yes.
that we like to think that we're casting pearls before swine. He said, but what if we're giving people undigestible concepts and calling it bread?
Well, and I think that is so true. I mean, a little joke I have is I try to teach uh, as if in such a way that a PhD could understand it. Uh, and good theology. I mean, no one has gone beyond. There was a man who had two sons.
Hmm.
No one has
Hmm.
gone beyond the depth of. There was a woman, and she lost some coins, or it might be for you and I, Sheri. There were some people who couldn't figure out where they put their cell phone, and they went looking all around the house until they found it. And all of us know the frantic search, and to imagine that God has the same impulse toward us and is going to look for that darned lost coin or lost person in tell, which is one of the most important words in the Bible, because it
Hmm.
doesn't have an ending. Uh,
Right.
the politician we love to hate, God is looking for them until they are healed. I mean,
Hmm.
there are certain politicians I'm not particularly fond of, and don't like their policies, and I think they're bad, but I always pray for them. I don't pray ever for them to succeed. I'm a little bit
Hmm.
like Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the 30s and 40s in Germany, in which he was praying for the end of the war, and perhaps that his country would surrender. I don't pray for them to succeed. I pray for them to be healed
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
God's terms, not my own, because sometimes
Right.
you see their childhood traumas being lived out on the global stage.
Right. For sure.
Uh,
For
you
sure.
know, And I think I need those same prayers too, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
for other traumas that I have, and other, when I have a Bible study group I lead weekly, and when I'm tempted to get on my high horse, uh, I always remember that spiritual that I grew up with, that it's me, O Lord, standing in need of prayer. Uh,
Yeah.
I
Right.
will I will live with Mary Oliver's grasshopper and be totally transfixed by that. And 5 minutes later, I'm just mad as heck about some little thing.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
standing in
Yeah.
need of prayer, or I'm
Yeah.
frightened by something. I just saw a news feed, and I'm tempted to have an invective toward any and all people who are those people.
Yeah.
But those people are also children of God, and I think both Whitehead and Jung would appreciate the comment by Henry Nouwen that beloved, broken, and blessed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We
Well,
we Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
We
Well, and
start
for
out
Jung,
beloved. Go ahead.
yeah, we start out beloved, and yeah. Well, and for Jung too, there's that sense in which we have to look honestly at others and all the things that we hate and dislike about them and recognize that all of those qualities lie within each of us, at
Yes.
least in potential.
Yes.
That there may come a press against us that would move us toward acting in those same ways. And if we don't
Yes.
acknowledge that, if we just think it's just out there,
Yes.
we are so psychologically immature, and we
Yes.
are just not holding the truth about life, which is that all of those qualities are in all of us, at least in potential, if not in fact in actuality.
Well, yes, and while Luther had his good and bad days, there's some truth to the saying, we are simultaneously sinners and saved at the same time.
Yeah.
One of my challenges, and with some of my friends who share my political viewpoint, is that were they to get into power, they might make some of the mistakes uh, that the current administration is making. One of the tragedies is when revolutions happen and they depend, as they've done in the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution or in Venezuela and other places, they use the same hardball tactics that they criticized in the others. There is no reason why a revolutionary cannot be, and I think Mandela did this is about as well as anybody. There's no reason why a revolutionary, when they gain power, can't reach out,
Hmm.
because otherwise you become just as violent as the ones you're trying to overthrow or have
Right.
overthrown. And
Right.
you know, I have to always remind myself that the people that I am least fond of, and I have trouble liking many Christians these days, are also children of God. And I
Hmm.
think you're right on target. I mean, I don't know the shadow work nearly as much as you do, obviously, but there is that negative shadow that either we're permitted to have by certain leaders, which I think is what's going on with Christians who follow Trump right now, that these allowing them to go with the negative shadow of things they're supposed to repress, uh, or we succumb to that which we don't love because we want power too.
Right. Right.
Uh,
And, I don't want to go deep into politics because that's really not the core of this
yeah.
channel, but, I do also feel so important. It's so important to say I so wish we could have, not you and I, but the broader public could have more nuanced conversations about
Well,
these
yeah,
things, because
yes,
in all cases I can see both sides of every issue,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I can understand why people feel the way they do. I
yes,
can really understand it. And
yes,
whether or not it's my choice or my path to
yes.
follow is beside the point. I can understand how people have gotten to where they are, and
Well,
it just
yes.
is so frustrating for me to see such and I blame a lot of the media for this, but to
Oh,
have
yes.
such dismissal of our fellow humans who
Yes.
are just dealing with forces that are chaotic
Well,
in different
yes.
ways. And so yeah, so
A
it's
term I've coined is prophetic healing.
hmm
You can challenge something and still realize that the challenge is intended not to harm but to heal.
right,
That
right.
the oppressor needs to be liberated from their oppression so they can experience abundant life. And it goes back to the sacred. Uh,
Hmm.
I pray for all these people these days because I need to for my sake. I need to for my
Yeah.
sake so that I don't become uh, the victim of my own hate. So it goes back to the sacred everywhere. The sacred if the it's like the you can't be a little bit omnipresent. You either are or you aren't. You can't
Right.
be a little bit. What don't you realize about everywhere? Uh,
Right.
if you say it's
Yeah.
everywhere, you
If it's
can't say it's not in that place.
right,
They
or
may
that
be
person or
missing it.
that thing.
I
Yeah.
love that the John's gospel in the first chapter, the true light that coming into the world enlightens everyone. And
Hmm.
John is well aware of darkness, but
Yeah.
there is a light that shines in everyone, and our calling is to see it and do what we can to bring it out and challenge in such a way that people know we're challenging it, injustice, but also challenging out of the sense that healing is something that has to happen to both of us.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes. We well, and before we close this part of the conversation, and go into our deeper dive, I want to just mention that there's this struggle of there's this, I guess it's around the idea of secularism and all that's happened in our
yes,
culture over the last
yes,
several decades. David Tacey, who I loved, has a book
oh
called The
yes,
Post Secular Sacred.
yes,
And he
yes,
talks about how what we've discovered is that secularism cannot deal with the violent forces within humanity, within human
yes,
nature, and therefore people are now in a post-secular sense seeking the sacred, but they don't
yes,
want anymore the God in the sky that's like the
yeah,
big cop that's separate from
yeah,
life on earth. God has
yes,
to fall into the earth, or has fallen into the earth.
yes,
And one of the dangers that we see today is that in the absence of a compelling myth, Jung would say, or a
yes, yes,
compelling sense of the sacred that we can engage with again, for those who are no longer interested in traditional and organized religion.
yes,
In the absence of that relationship with a transpersonal source, we get hooked into all of these ideologies that are, the human has an instinctual need to worship, and
yes,
that Jung would say, and an instinctual need to have a religious orientation
yes,
toward life that has nothing to do with doctrines or dogmas or traditions. But there's just this sense of trusting the flow of life
yes,
that is an instinctual need of us to relate to a transpersonal sacred, where we can project out our sense of wholeness onto something else until
yes,
we have the inner ego strength to live it out internally. And so,
yes,
in the absence of a religion or a spirituality that can hold and contain those forces, we latch on to these ideologies that will never satisfy that need,
yes.
but they become religious, and we become zealots for them.
Well, yes, the restless heart of Augustine, or Jesus in his conversation with Pilate, which is not an otherworldly conversation when he says, "My kingdom is not of this world." I think
Hmm.
he is saying, "What you're doing is cannot encompass the vision I have. You're
Yeah,
you're still trying to solve it at the ground level.
right.
My vision is not tied into the win-lose, defeat your opponent, uh, give me this and I'll give you that. My vision is bigger than that, and it includes all of us, and it challenges, but it challenges only to heal. And that's,
Yeah.
I think, what's been missing in Christianity's image of God. Quite often it has been, you know, that God's challenges, and I'm using that in an anthropomorphic sense, but you know what I'm talking about, are intended to punish us when, they use the term the great physician. So if you actually have a good physician, you may need surgery, but the purpose of surgery is you can get up and walk again. The
Right.
purpose of God is the great physician or the great pharmacist, that does
Yeah.
not aim to hurt anyone, but aims to heal everyone.
Yeah. Well, and I'll end with this until we'll pause before the going into the second part of our conversation. But, oftentimes when I was in the thickest, worst part of my own journey toward healing of my
Yes,
own trauma and early life experiences,
yes.
I would often say it's as if I'm taking a surgical knife to myself and I don't know whether it's going to kill me or heal me.
Well, yes,
But the faith was that it would heal me, and it
yes,
did. And it
yes,
did. Yeah.
yes.
Well, we're going to pause here, but in the next part of our conversation, I want to ask you to tell us a little bit more about your experience as a child of deconstruction, that your
Okay.
loss of faith at the age of 11, and
Yeah.
how you recovered that, and then just some of the other more mystical side of things
Okay.
that are in your book and are in other
Yeah.
conversations we've had. So let's pause here, and then we'll continue. Thanks for listening to the first half of this episode. If you'd like to go deeper, the full episode is available for paid subscribers of The Sacred Everywhere at sherikling.substack.com. Find the link in the show notes. Until next time, may you notice the sacred everywhere.